Let's go to our Bibles. We turn again to the book of Joshua. This morning we're going to be in chapters 9 and 10, first part of chapter 10. So starting in chapter 9, two stories I want to cover this morning that are connected really by a primary truth that's brought out in both of these passages. One thing that becomes clear and known to us as Christians, you don't have to be a Christian very long to begin to learn that whenever you try or attempt to do something for God, the enemy always comes along and raises opposition to that. He fights that. He doesn't want to see you accomplishing anything for God. He doesn't want to see you being in any way successful for God. And so Satan comes along, our enemy comes along, he opposes us, he rises up, he stands against us. This truth is certainly illustrated throughout Scripture, and one such example of that is where we are now in this section of the book of Joshua. Israel was not going to conquer Canaan easily, nor would one decisive battle give the nation of Israel the entirety of the land of Canaan. The opening verses here of chapters 9, 10, and chapter 11 as well, all recount for us the intensifying of enemy opposition. Just if you note it in chapter 9, I'll point it out here, the first couple of verses. It came to pass when all the kings which were on this side Jordan, in the hills and in the valleys, and all the coasts of the great sea, over against Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusites, heard thereof, they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. Nations that were perhaps previously, most likely enemies, now allied themselves, come together in order to do battle against the nation of Israel. It says, when they heard thereof. Heard what? Well, they heard about, I'm sure, Ai. No doubt they heard about Jericho. So they heard these stories. These stories begin to filter through the land. And so these nations gather together now, unify themselves, ally themselves as one force against Israel. And this intensifying of opposition always seems to follow a great victory as you kind of follow the story on through these chapters. The enemies of Israel will respond with increasing force and greater determination to defeat God's people, especially after the nation of Israel has won a great victory. So with this opposition in mind, I want to show you this morning how chapters 9 and the first part of chapter 10 provide us with an interesting contrast. But it's this contrast that links these two incidents together, these two chapters together, and shows to us the necessity of prayer when it comes to our facing opposition. I want you to notice two key statements are made in these two sections of Scripture. Again, in chapter 9, look at verse 14. Verse 14, and the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. Then flip over to chapter 10 and look at a couple of places. First part of verse 12. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. Verse 14. And there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man. For the Lord fought for Israel. So these two chapters and these two stories contained in these chapters are linked together by prayer. One, as we note in chapter 9, was a failure to pray. But then in chapter 10, we see a tremendous result, a supernatural result, as a response to prayer. In fact, the writer here is so overwhelmed and blown away by what happens, he says, this has never happened before, that God would respond, would hearken to the voice of a man and do what he has done on that particular day, in that particular event. But the key element in both these stories that I want you to notice is prayer. One, a failure to pray, and one, achieving a great accomplishment through prayer. And so from this, we can certainly learn about the absolute necessity of prayer, in particular as we face the enemy face the opposition against us. And that principle, or that principle that's contained in these stories is certainly repeated in the New Testament. Paul does so where he teaches on the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. Put on the whole armor that you might stand against the wiles of the devil. And then he says at the close of that passage, praying always with all prayer and supplication. Prayer is an important element, perhaps the most vital of all of that. It kind of brings all that armor together. Prayer is an absolute necessity as we face the enemy, as he opposes us. So I want to consider what these two passages have to say to us from this perspective of prayer, whether it's a neglect to pray as we should, or whether it's a powerful response to prayer, as we see in chapter 10. Both illustrate the same truth, and that is prayer is absolutely necessary when confronting opposition. So let's see this, all right, in two ways this morning. Number one, we learn from chapter 9, prayer is necessary if we are to obtain God's wisdom. Prayer is necessary if we are to obtain God's wisdom. And oh, how we need God's wisdom. But we receive it, by and large, through prayer. That is certainly one of the main ways in which we receive wisdom from God. Now, Joshua chapter 9 deals with the trickery of the Gibeonites in deceiving Israel into a treaty. To understand why this was such a bad thing, we only need to go back to a few references in the law. And I won't take you there. I won't take the time to go through these references, but it's repeated 3 or 4 times there in Exodus, at least twice, Deuteronomy, twice as well. It's stated very clearly that the nation of Israel, as they go into the land, is not to make any treaty, any covenant with any nations in that land, any neighboring nations. They're to make no treaty, no covenants. And these texts, I'll give you the references if you're interested. Exodus 23, 31 through 33 is one place. Exodus 34, 12 and surrounding verses would be another place. Then it's repeated in Deuteronomy, just as they're about to enter the land. 40 years later, Moses repeats it in chapter 7, verse 2, and again, surrounding verses there. But it's made very clear to the nation of Israel, when you go into the land, you are to destroy all the nations there. You don't save any of them alive. You conquer each and every one. And a reason clearly is spelled out. God says to them, if you don't do that, they're going to become a snare to you. What's going to happen if you allow them to remain, you're going to start worshiping their gods. And then you're going to bring down my judgment upon you. So God makes it very clear what he wants the nation of Israel to do as they go into this land. But there's a little twist that takes place, and I do want you to turn to this in Deuteronomy chapter 20. And take a look at this with me. Deuteronomy chapter 20. Because all this now is setting the scene for what's going to happen with the Gibeonites as they approach Joshua and the leaders of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, let me just pick it up at verse 10. Let me just read just a few verses here. When thou comest nigh unto a city to fight against it, then proclaim peace unto it. And it shall be, if it make thee answer of peace, and open unto thee, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries or servants unto thee, and they shall serve thee. And if it will make no peace, but will make war against thee, then thou shalt besiege it. And when the Lord thy God hath delivered into thine hands, thou shalt smite every male thereof with the edge of the sword. Now what's going on here? Now God had said at least 3 times through Moses, you go in, you conquer everybody. You leave no one alive. Now God's saying, certain cities you can go to, and if they're willing to make peace with you, then leave them alone. Enter into a treaty, make them your servants. Well, the distinction, the difference here you'll notice is found in verse 15. Thus shalt thou do unto all the cities which are very far off from thee, which are not of the cities of these nations. So a distinction is being drawn here. If there is a nation that you come across that is distant from you, not a part of the land of Canaan, then we'll let them remain there, as long as they're willing to make peace. But God goes on here, but of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth. And thou shalt utterly destroy, verse 17 goes on and names again many of these nations. So again, this is at least the fourth time now God has repeated this instruction to Israel, that those that are a part of the land of Canaan, your neighboring nations, are to be destroyed, completely wiped out, nothing left alive. So I say all that to set the scene for what's happening now in Joshua chapter 9. It seems likely that the Gibeonites knew all of this. Notice what they say in chapter 9, verse 6, as they approach Joshua and the leaders of the nation of Israel. They went to Joshua unto the camp at Gilgal and said unto him and to the men of Israel, we be come from a far country. Now therefore make you a league with us. Verse 9, after Joshua and the leaders had quizzed them a little bit about their statement, they said unto him, from a very far country thy servants are come, because of the name of the Lord thy God. For we have heard the fame of him and all that he did in Egypt. So the Gibeonites use this information that's contained in the law, which apparently, again, somehow they knew about, that Israel was instructed to leave alive any distant nations. As long as they're willing to make peace, you leave them alive. They knew that. They acted on that. And as the story unfolds, we see Joshua and the leadership entering into a treaty with these Gibeonites. And so this story is meant to impress upon us how Israel suffered from a lack of wisdom. And by their example, we need to learn a very vital lesson, that like Israel, we too are in need, desperate need, of God's wisdom. And we know this wisdom is available to us through prayer. As James tells us in chapter 1, if any of you lack wisdom, which by the way, we can all fit ourselves into that category, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and upbraideth not. But you see what happens here, as I pointed out in verse 14, they asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. But from this story, what I want you to see are at least two reasons why it's absolutely necessary for us to pray and seek wisdom from God, especially when we are encountering our enemy, undergoing opposition. Number one, first of all, we need God's wisdom because the enemy is very deceptive. The enemy is very deceptive. The Gibeonites are going to point that out to us here. But it does remind us of how Satan operates and how deceptive he can be. Let me just take a moment and just kind of point to the deceptive tactics that these Gibeonites use here in tricking Joshua and the leadership. Number one, we note here the Gibeonites come with tangible evidence. Look at verses 4 and 5. They did work wily or craftily. They went and made as if they had been ambassadors or that they had come from a distant place. They took old sacks upon their asses, wine bottles old and rent and bound up, old shoes clouded upon their feet, old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. Verse 12, they speak to the leadership. This our bread we took hot for our provision out of our houses on the day we came forth to go unto you. But now, behold, it's dry and it's moldy. And these bottles of wine which we filled were new. And behold, they be rent. And these our garments and our shoes are become old by reason of the very long journey. So they come with tangible evidence. Everything of theirs is worn out. Grain sacks, wineskins, sandals, clothes. Their bread is dry and crusty. The tangible evidence that they present all seems certainly very credible. But you notice, even with this evidence, Joshua and the elders were a little bit suspicious of all of this at the first. In verses 7 and 8, you'll notice they quiz them a little bit. The men of Israel said to them, peradventure, you dwell among us. How shall we make a league with you? And they said to Joshua, we are thy servants. And Joshua said, who are you? And from whence come you? So you notice here, it wasn't a matter of Joshua and the leadership not doing a little bit of due diligence. They asked the right questions. The problem was, the issue was, they left God out of their decision. It wasn't that they didn't think, but that they didn't pray. And that was the issue at hand here. And that's what led them into making a very foolish decision that went clearly against God's will. But I think about this, I look at this as an example truly of how Satan operates. Everything looks very good up front, doesn't it? He comes at us with tangible evidence that his way is okay. He holds something out for us and promises us something, but the reality is oftentimes, and perhaps I could even say always, much different than what it is he presents to us. That's the opposition that we deal with. And if we just look at it from human reasoning and a human perspective, we could come away with the same idea that Joshua and the leaders of Israel come away with, that everything looks good. We should proceed. The circumstances are all lining up. Doors are opening. Everything's working out just right. And so we go on those, that appearance in and of itself without looking to God and asking God for wisdom and direction. And we do that to our own hurt. We need God's wisdom. The enemy can be very clever. And so they came with tangible evidence. Number 2, notice they offer a realistic report. Let's look at verses 9 and 10. They offer a realistic report. They say, we come from a very far country. Because of the name of the Lord thy God we've come. We've heard the fame of him and all that he did in Egypt and all he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were beyond Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, which were at Ashtaroth. They claim they were moved into coming because of what the Lord had done, notice it, in Egypt, and how he had wiped out Sihon and Og on the eastern side of the Jordan, the other side of the Jordan. But what really moved them to come? Well, verse 3 tells us, and when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai, they did work craftily. So they were actually moved to come by more recent events. But you notice when speaking with Joshua and the leadership, they don't mention Jericho or Ai at all. The reason being is because they had come from a distant land, supposedly. And so that kind of news couldn't possibly have traveled that quickly. They couldn't have heard of these latest developments. And so they give a report of things that had happened sometime much more in distant history of the nation. They use that as their excuse for having come. But they have one more deceptive tactic up their sleeve, and that's also found in verse 9, and that's this. They provide a spiritual testimony. Notice again, he says, they say, we've come because of the name of the Lord thy God, for we've heard the fame of him. They say it was the reputation of the God of Israel that drew them because of the mighty acts that they have heard of. It's interesting to compare their supposed spiritual testimony with that of what Rahab had to say. You remember her testimony when she took in the spies? We won't flip back to it, but if you wanted to contrast or compare it, it's in chapter 2, verses 10 through 13. If you flip back there, you can see very similar. Rahab's testimony and her testimony of faith and what the Gibeonites are saying here. So how do we know the difference between what is a true testimony of faith as presented by Rahab and a testimony of nothing more than flattery, which is really what the Gibeonites are giving here? Well, it can be difficult to know what is true, what is real, what is genuine. And that's why, I think and I say we as the church as a whole, the evangelical church, needs to be a little cautious, when we hear of these famous people supposedly getting saved. And the church just want to kind of rush to embrace them and welcome them in. And I understand the compulsion to do that. But sometimes I think we just need to be a little more discerning, give it a little more time and see, is this testimony genuine? Because a lot of times you find out that they're so far off base that their experience could not have been a true biblical conversion at all. But because someone is a famous athlete or actress or musician or whatever it is, and now they say that they're saved, we want to believe it. And rightly so, I would say. But we need to use some wisdom, right? Before we just open our arms and embrace that and assume that they have a real, genuine salvation experience. Because people will have varying motives. And they may be trying to revive a career. I mean, we don't know what might really be going on, and we need to just use some discernment. Well, they offered up this spiritual testimony. And so in light of all of this, the fact they present this evidence and they look very, everything looks very up and up as they approach and they give this spiritual testimony. In light of all this, we can understand how Israel needed wisdom, but they neglected wisdom, as verse 14 again points out. The Lord's direction was available to them, but it was ignored. And so this passage warns us of this attitude of, I've got this. I have this all under control. I know what I'm doing. Everything's lining up. I don't need to consult the Lord about this. I don't need to ask for his direction on this matter. And so we just go ahead and proceed and move forward based on how everything seems to appear to us. And we forget something very important. Our need is no different than Israel's. We need the wisdom of God to detect our subtle enemy. Satan is, after all, described as a deceiver. Paul makes that clear at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 3, 13, and 14. And that context specifically is talking about false religions, false teaching. But he's very deceptive. Satan is, our enemy is. He appears, Paul says in that passage, you know the passage, he comes to us as an angel of light. And should it not surprise us, therefore, then that his ministers also come as angels of light. And we need to be cautious and careful. Listen carefully to the message that's being proclaimed, even as Ken in his prayer before I came up to preach, how true that is. There are many across this country, around the world, preaching a very different gospel than what the scriptures present. It may be a health and wealth gospel, it may be a works-related gospel, but it's no gospel at all. And God's people need to be discerning in this. And by the way, let me just give a commercial here. If you get Netflix, there's a documentary on there right now called American Gospel. It's not something you would expect to see on Netflix. I'll tell you, it's excellent. It's rather lengthy, a couple hours in length, but time moves quickly. It's so well done. The first portion of it just presents a clear presentation of the true gospel. And then the second portion of it deals with a lot of the false prosperity type preachers. And it doesn't hesitate to name names. And it's very good. American Gospel, it's called. Justin Peters is featured pretty prominently in it. We listened to his DVD here a few summers ago on Sunday nights. I went through some of his teaching. But it's just excellent. And I recommend it to you very highly if this is something more you want to pursue. But Satan's very subtle, very clever. We need wisdom from God because of the deceptive nature of the enemy. Number two, just briefly, let me note here, we need God's wisdom because our decisions may have long-term consequences. We need God's wisdom because we can make some foolish decisions, and sometimes those decisions can get us in a mess. And the mess we make can linger for a lengthy period of time, perhaps even through the entirety of our lives. And so we need the wisdom from God before we make those kinds of decisions that are going to put our life into a mess and now cause us to live in that for the rest of our lives upon this earth. As the story unfolds here, we see that they do enter into this treaty with the Gibeonites. Verse 15 tells us that. But then they discover that the Gibeonites actually live nearby. And they've been tricked into this oath. Verse 16, notice, it came to pass at the end of 3 days, after they had made a league with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors, and that they dwelt among them. So now what do? They've entered into this treaty, but they did so because they were deceived. So do they have the right now to go back on their word? Can they in fact break this treaty? That seems to be what the nation wants to do, what the people want the leadership to do. Notice in verse 18, and the children of Israel smote them not, because the princes of the congregation had sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel. And all the congregation murmured against the princes. Now it says princes, it just means the leadership, the elders, Joshua and the elders, the leaders who made this foolish decision. So you notice here what's going on. The rest of the congregation, the nation, they're not any too happy about this. They know better. They know what's happened. They know now that they've made an agreement with a nation that they were supposed to wipe out. And so they murmured against the leadership. Verse 19, notice, but all the princes said unto the congregation, we have sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. So you get the impression, although the text doesn't say it, you get the impression that the people wanted the leadership to go back on their word. And probably, press the point. Well, you were deceived, so therefore that's not binding. You need to go back on that, break that oath, and let's do what God has told us to do, and that is to wipe them out. But notice how the leadership responds to that. We can't do that. We've made an agreement. We're bound to that, and now we need to stick to our word. And they go on, and they say in verse 20, this we will do to them. We will even let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath which we swore unto them. Leadership knows that if they break this oath, and they're dishonoring the name of God, and it'll now be worse for them. Now they'll bring the judgment down of God upon them if they should break this oath. If they break this oath now, they're basically saying their testimony is that you can't trust the God of Israel. He's a covenant breaker, just like his people are covenant breakers. So now they're bound to this. Now they have to live with this. So what do? They allow the Gibeonites to live, but they are going to become their servants. They become woodcutters and water carriers for Israel's sanctuary. Verses 21 and 23 point out. But the point being here, Israel was stuck. They could not break this oath, even though it had been wrongly obtained, because they had wrongly neglected the wisdom of God. So now they had to live as faithfully as they could in what was certainly a very ill-conceived situation. And the outcome of this, the application of this, kind of spills over into our Christian experience. Sometimes God's people are called to live obediently within the results of their own foolishness. We make foolish decisions. We don't seek God's wisdom, either because of sin, or sometimes not necessarily because of sin. But we make foolish decisions. And oftentimes we bear consequences from those decisions. Now we seek repentance and forgiveness, and we know we are forgiven. If it was something that was done sinfully, we're forgiven. We know we receive God's grace in our lives. But the consequences of those decisions aren't necessarily removed from our lives. So what we do now, we move on. We live as obediently and as faithfully as we can now. It doesn't mean we're done, as we're going to see with Israel here as we move into the next chapter in just a few moments. It doesn't mean we're done or that God is done with us. But there may be ongoing consequences. We see that with David's decision, his foolish decision, to enter into a relationship with Bathsheba, then kill her husband. He received forgiveness, we know, but boy, did the consequences of that decision continue to linger in his life. But he lived faithfully and obediently, following his confession, even though the consequences remained. He lived as faithfully and as obediently as he then could, even though he experienced those ongoing consequences. So we need to be faithful to God even in the midst of our mistakes. And just realize, be assured that his grace does not cease simply because we have been foolish. Well, we need God's wisdom because our enemy is crafty and deceitful. And the way we receive it, the main way anyway, I'll say, is through prayer. Just by asking. And ask for it often. Because we need it often. Because, by the way, we're facing opposition every day. That's a legitimate prayer to make every day. Pray for wisdom. Because you're going to face opposition as you move out through the course of your day. And we need God's wisdom to help us. Let me give you a second principle. Number 2, prayer is necessary if we are to obtain spiritual victory. All right, let's move into chapter 10. And we'll cover some ground quickly here in these first 14 verses. An amazing story takes place, and it shows us, again, the importance of prayer. In this case, if we're going to obtain spiritual victory, we need God on our side, fighting for us. And this chapter focuses on Israel's success in their southern campaign. 5 nations now align themselves, and they're going to attack Gibeon. As the story unfolds in chapter 10, now we see another coalition of nations coming together. But this time, it's not to fight against Israel directly, but they've heard that the Gibeonites have made a treaty with Israel. And by the way, the Gibeonites were a pretty powerful nation, as verse number 2 points out. You'll notice there. And so these nations were fearful now that now there's this alliance between Israel and the Gibeonites. So they decide, well, we need to break this alliance. And the best thing for us to do is to attack the Gibeonites, try to destroy them, and therefore weaken Israel, was their thinking. Well, the Gibeonites get wind of this, and they send help to a call out to Joshua, asking for Joshua to come to their aid. Now, think about this for a moment. Here's the character of Joshua. Joshua could have said right then and there, I found a loophole to all of this. We made an agreement that we can't destroy the Gibeonites, but we never said anything about any other nations destroying the Gibeonites. Here's our way out of this mess. We'll just sit back, do nothing, let those nations proceed against Gibeon and destroy them, and we're delivered from this covenant, this treaty we had made with them. He could have done that, but he doesn't. Joshua is a man of his word. He's given his word, and so he is going to do everything he can to protect this nation that he has entered into this agreement with. But you'll notice it seems Joshua has learned a valuable lesson from his experience with the Gibeonites. And that is this: stay in communication with God. Look at verse 8. And the Lord said unto Joshua, and then as I read at the beginning, verse 12, then spake Joshua to the Lord. And then again, verse 14, there was no day like it or after it that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Joshua learned something very important. Pray. Seek God's wisdom. Seek God's help. And so he stays in communication, and things turn out much different here in this story. Again, let me just point out two quick principles or truths here I want you to see from this. Number one, through prayer, we receive the assurance of God's promises. Through prayer, we receive the assurance of God's promises. Look at verses 7 through 9. So he gets this call from the Gibeonites, come and help us. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly and went up from Gilgal all night. You'll notice in verse 8 here, God assures Joshua by repeating a promise that he had already given Joshua back in chapter 1, verse 5. No new revelation, no new word of assurance, but God simply reaffirms a promise that he had made to Joshua previously. By the way, that's how God is most often going to work in your own life, assuring you and comforting your heart. Don't expect some new truth to be revealed to you exclusively, but expect God to use his word to challenge you, to assure you, and to comfort you in promises that have been contained in this book for thousands and thousands of years. And God will take that promise, those promises, and he will apply them specifically to a specific need and situation that you are currently facing. Now, why did Joshua need to hear from God? Why did Joshua need to have a promise that was already issued to him, reaffirmed at this particular point in time in his situation? The reason is, I believe, is because circumstances have changed. Joshua entered into an agreement that he was not supposed to enter into. He made an alliance with a nation he should not have made an alliance with. And he did that foolishly. He did that without seeking God's wisdom. And now he has to face the consequences of that decision. And so he needs to know, is God with me or not? Am I going to face the same fate that we faced when we made our first assault on Ai? Is that going to be our experience now? Is God going to fight for us, knowing that I have done this foolish thing? And so God comes to Joshua and repeats a promise he had made to Joshua early on. And expect God to work that way in your own life. This is his usual way of reassuring his children. Not by unveiling some new truth to them that was previously unknown, but by reaffirming promises that have already been given. And that's why we go to the scriptures. And that's why we look at the promises found in the Word of God. And that's why those promises will speak to us in a new way, a fresh way, as we face a new crisis or a new situation, sometimes even a situation brought upon us by our own foolish decisions. And God still reaffirms his faithfulness to us and assures us that he is with us and that he will help us. And that's what God's people usually need. Not some new truth, but old truth that's applied to their current situation. Oftentimes a very pressing need that we might have. And you notice here that verse 9 shows how the divine reassurance received in verse 8 results in faithful action. God promises victory, but his victory would be achieved through a night march and a surprise attack. Very similar to what we noted last week in chapter 8. At Ai, where God says in verse 1, I have given Ai into your hand. And then in verse 7, they're to go out and ambush the city, because God says there, I will deliver Ai into your hand. The promise is made, but then God's people act upon the promise and allow God to work through us in accordance to his word. And as I mentioned last week regarding that truth, God's promises are sure and can be relied upon, but God's people are still to act in faithfulness upon them if we are to see those promises realized in our experience. Through prayer, we receive the assurance of God's promise. Second, through prayer, we receive the provision of God's power. And that's going to be found in verses 10 through 14. I want you to notice here, if you would with me, how God's power is displayed in this section. Two ways. Number one, we notice here, God is the warrior who defeats the enemy. He is the warrior who defeats the enemy. Verses 10 and 11. You'll notice verse 10 contains four verbs. The Lord discomfited or confused them, the enemy. He slew them with a great slaughter. He chased them and he smote them. Four verbs. Some translations, the NIV among them, only attributes the first verb to God. God confused the enemy. And then Israel does the rest. Chases, pursues, whatever, smites them. The King James, I think, gets it right here. The King James attributes all four verbs to God. God is the one who is doing the work here. God is the warrior. It seems strange maybe to hear God as pursuing. But God is pursuing. He's doing it through his people. But God is the cause. God is the one who is doing the fighting. He is the warrior who is after the enemy. And so this entire passage is dealing with and declaring the source and cause of Israel's victory. You notice verse 11 points that out quite clearly by virtue of the fact that it was the Lord who rained down hailstones upon the enemy. And then it says about that they were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. So God is the one. More perished by the Lord's hail than by Israel's sword. You know, it's too bad, I think, that the church of today has lost this vision of God as the warrior who fights for his people. And I think perhaps it's because this imagery seems too violent for many. The popular image of Jesus is that he's not only kind and tender, but he's also kind of soft and prissy. You've seen the pictures, the paintings, right? He looks like a fashion model. But that's not the Jesus. That's not the God of the Bible. And such a Jesus can hardly comfort the soul that is daily assaulted by the enemy. We need to have an understanding and learn the truth that's presented in places like Psalm 24, where the question is asked, who is the King of glory? And the answer is, he is the Lord strong and mighty. He is the Lord mighty in battle. No mild God or soft Jesus is going to be a comfort to the people of God when we are confronted by a very powerful supernatural enemy such as the devil and his minions. But we have a warrior God who is fighting on our behalf. And it's only as we know the warrior of Israel who fights for us that we can have any hope of triumphing over the ugliness of our current culture, where the enemy seems to be gaining every advantage. But we have a God who is sufficient for these things, a God who fights for us. And we need to see this God as the warrior who defeats the enemy. Then second, let's just note it quickly here. God is the sovereign who controls the universe. He is the sovereign who controls the universe. You know the story, right? As it unfolds just in a brief couple of verses, in verses 12 through 14, where it speaks here of the sun standing still. Now we know the sun doesn't move, the earth revolves around the sun. But from the perspective of those on the earth, it seems as though it was the sun standing still. But what's happening here? Well, all I know for sure regarding what happens in this miracle is that it's a miracle that took place in response to Joshua's prayer. He prays in verse 12, actually speaking as it related here to the sun. Sun, stand still upon Gibeon, thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher, a book that was lost to us now, obviously? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. So what seems to be happening is God just kind of maybe slowed down the rotation of the earth. So instead of the earth going around the sun in 24 hours, it went around the sun perhaps in 48 hours, we might say. But what this allows Joshua to do and the nation of Israel, the army of Israel, is to have, we would suppose, enough daylight in order for them to continue to engage the enemy in battle and bring complete destruction upon them. But regardless of all that's going on here, and by the way, as you might know, skeptics, of course, criticize this and kind of laugh at this, but we'll just take it at face value because we know the power of God. We'll accept it as the story is told here. But you want to notice here the author puts his emphasis on the fact that this day was so unique, not so much for the extended daylight, but because God listened to a man's prayer. In verse 14, there was no day like that day before it or after it. Why? In what way? That the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. The author is blown away that the sovereign of the universe listened to the voice of a man. We know that to be true. Now, we may not be able to slow down the rotation of the earth around the sun, but yet we know that the sovereign of the universe listens to the voice of a man or a woman who comes to him and seeks him by prayer. And so the takeaway here this morning is to realize how vital prayer is. And we need to wrap this up because we're out of time, but to overlook prayer is to set ourselves up for the possibility of making foolish decisions, as we see in verse 9 or chapter 9, or set us up for the possibility of battling without the Lord's strength and power at work in our lives, as evidenced here in chapter 10. We need God's wisdom. We need God's power. We need the spiritual victory that He provides. It comes through prayer. We have a powerful enemy, but we know also greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world, and we access Him through prayer. We obtain His help, His wisdom through prayer. It's a vital necessity in facing the enemy. Joshua had to learn it the hard way, but learn it he did. And what he accomplished through prayer is indeed an amazing thing, that the sovereign of the universe would hearken to the voice of a man, or to the voice of a woman, for that matter. Let's pray.